Okay. And also the interim executive director, and we are very lucky tonight to have Angela Gupta with us. As it says, she's the extension forester from the University of Minnesota. And we met a couple months ago, and literally within 2 minutes, I was hooked. I just wanted to hear more and more and more and more. I learned what I shouldn't have in my yard. Just hoping they die over the winter so I don't have to dig them up. But it's fascinating, and so I'm really excited. I think this is going to be a wonderful educational lecture. This is part 1 of 2. So you will be back with Mary Nesberg, the University of Minnesota Ag Extension Coordinator, for a joint presentation coming up in the future. So check the website for that. But I don't want to delay. Please welcome Angela Gupta, our forestry expert.
Hey, so we're optimistic. Okay, meeting is being recorded. If I move this, that little bar should go away. Okay, so actually I'm gonna go back. So right, I'm gonna talk today about understanding our forest history and preparing for a future, our changing future. So I'm gonna lead up to the next presentation and leave you all hanging. That's my plan. And I'm gonna start way back. So there we go. Yeah, there we go. That should be. All right. So first, I just want to point out that Minnesota was glaciated. We weren't in southeast Minnesota was not in the last glacial period, but this is my best guess or my best take at a receding glacier. And the point here is, since the time Minnesota glaciers retreated, there have been humans on this landscape. So there has never been a time in Minnesota's forest history like that is relevant to today that there haven't been human stewards on the landscape. I think sometimes we forget that. Now, the human stewards changed over time. And so if we think about our Dakota indigenous communities, Mindote is their founding place, their original being. And that is at the confluence of the Mississippi and the St. Croix rivers, which is now on Fort Snelling. And so if you think about that, it's where they believe they came from. They are the original peoples that came after glaciation and the original stewards of our resources. There's a lot of really great information in the book Tending the Wild about indigenous stewardship and land management. Now that book was all done in California, but they went back and they talked to the local elders and they really talked about land management, carrying capacity of the land, and how it would have been used by indigenous stewards. And I think that really matters as we move forward, but is commonly forgotten. And the clicker, we're probably going to use that. And so things were doing, they were as they were until 1541 when De Soto had his expedition up the Mississippi River. And they were explorers coming to see the sights. His original journals talk about a forest garden, a lot of community and cultures, very large communities in this Mississippi River Valley. But shortly behind him, it probably felt a lot like this. So when Europeans arrived carrying germs, which thrived in dense semi-urban populations, the indigenous people of the Americas were effectively doomed. They had never experienced smallpox, measles, or flu before, and viruses tore through the continent, killing an estimated 90% of Native Americans. So that is a tremendous loss of human life. It also means that 90% of the land stewards were likely killed. And it means that they didn't need 90% of the resources that they had needed before the pandemics. So from a forestry perspective, that means what was likely pretty heavily tended landscapes became likely neglected out of lack of ability. There weren't the people to do it, and lack of need because they only needed 10% of the resources they needed before mortality. Now, we don't know how long it took for this level of mortality, but let's just reflect. COVID was what, 1.5% mortality? And I felt like it was horribly disruptive, right? To our individual beings, to our communities, to sort of the world as we know it. So if we had 90%, so I counted 15 people in this room, there'd be like 2 tops. That's a drastic change. So that had global consequences. It absolutely had consequences on North America. Very similar, possibly even higher mortality was happening in South America, post-European contact. But there is reason to think, and there's evidence in this book and others, 1491 by Charles Mann, that flush of new growth that happened when the stewards weren't stewarding, when they weren't burning the woods for oak and acorn production, that the whole flush of new trees developed. And that flush of new trees may have actually influenced global climate. Now, there's some confounding factors with some volcanic eruptions, but there is reason to think that it might have actually helped exacerbate or even initiate some of the famines in Europe, which ironically then led to some of the migration that we saw in European settlement in North America, right? So it's sort of fascinating to think about this from like a tree perspective. It also means that short of those very first explorers, we have almost no records of what that land looked like when it was actively stewarded and managed by a large population, right? Because by the time the next group of Europeans walked this place, trees would have grown up in their wake in that absence of stewardship. And so even when we go back and look at those original land records, it's maybe a questionable time to think it was a reasonable status quo, which I'll really talk about next time when we look at our future. So really kind of interesting, but there's a lot of absence of data, which is a little bit hard to know what to do with. And then even after this great mortality, people were still here trying to reorganize their communities, using the landscape, and they used it really differently than we use it. They use it really differently than European settlers used it, and they used it in ways that were really hard for European settlers to recognize. And that later causes a lot of trouble. So they were here and they were utilized. And I would also like to point out there were Europeans making appearances and doing things, right? So it wasn't necessarily like you were just recovering from a massive pandemic. You were also having to deal with these foreigners showing up and being weird. I suspect that's safe to say they did not really understand each other well. So what did that look like? So first, I just want to say we probably all know this, but Minnesota Moka is the Dakota word. Again, they are the original people. They placed themselves in this place right after the glaciers receded. And so this is where we get our name, where the waters reflect the clouds. And the water in the history of Minnesota is quite important. So if you don't know, the Dakota place their homelands here, but the Ojibwe do not. The Ojibwe place, their origin story starts in the northeastern United States, and then there was a 7 fires prophecy. As a part of that prophecy, they moved to the land where I didn't think to pull that exact quote, but where the grain grows from the water. Somebody want to correct me? I'm close. So it was a reference to wild rice. And so they moved into this place where the Dakota already was. So that might have been awkward. I wasn't there, but it feels like it was a little bit tense. So if you, I'm going to come back to that in a little bit, but and I think this deep history is interesting. So if you're not familiar with this book, The Feast of Virgins and Other Poems, it is an interesting read. It is a book of poetry. I brought it. This is a horrible rendition, because it is the original is beautiful and has beautiful drawings. It is organized in chapters and whatnot, and this is not. It's like someone just typed it all up and printed it. But it is like in iambic pentameter, so think Shakespeare, and it's a poem. And it turns out we don't generally consider poetry to be nonfiction. So that's maybe something to reflect about, right? We count it as art and not as like historical fact. But he lived in Minnesota from 1840 to 1880, and he wrote extensively about the Dakota and the communities here. And in his footnotes, which I'm going to treat a whole lot more like facts, because he's now describing the text that he writes in poetry, he describes Mahoto, the polar bear. This is a direct quote. Ursus Maritimeus with the Dakota said that in olden times, white bears were often found about Rainy Lake and Lake of the Woods in winter, and sometimes as far south as the mouth of the Minnesota River. They say one was once killed at White Bear Lake, but a few miles from St. Paul and Minneapolis, and they therefore named it Lake Matoto, White Bear Lake, literally Lake White Bear. So can you imagine a time when polar bears roamed? Right, so their cultural heritage identifies a time when polar bears were in Minnesota. So wow, that's a different Minnesota than we're thinking about today, right? So another footnote from this book I found to be really fascinating. So remember, the Ojibwe came in and moved into the Dakota territory. So the Bloody River, the Red River, was so called on account of the numerous Indian battles that have been fought on its banks. The Ojibwe say that its waters were colored red by the blood of many warriors slain on its banks in the fierce wars between themselves and the Dakotas. So this land has always been very high value. And it was high value because they needed the resources. It was also controversial long before white people showed up. So I think these are important to remember. Rivers play a key component in land management in Minnesota. So here there's battles about the Red River. Rivers were major transportation corridors for indigenous communities and for white settlers. This is going to influence land management. So it's hard to find pictures, but you can do a PowerPoint, pictures are important. So this is a depiction, a painting near St. Paul in 1848. This is Little Crow's Village. And I want you to notice the landscape and the things around it. First, it's all canoe transportation. Now we know the Mississippi River was a massive transportation corridor. This is what DeSoto came up. This is what the steamboats came up. This is what the indigenous people used. We also know from archaeological records and forestry history records that the areas closest to major transportation corridors were the most intensely used. This makes sense, right? So it means they were most intensely burned. It means they were most intentionally managed for nuts, most intensely managed for protein. So think wildlife. And so it is not surprising that the banks here those bluffs are barren. They were very likely burnt, and they were very likely burnt quite regularly by those indigenous communities. So that work out of California talks about how indigenous people burned their oak stands every year because they needed those acorns to be weevil free in order to be a good protein source and to be storable for the winter. The easiest way to make them weevil free is to burn every year, and then you keep your pest numbers down. We would call this today integrated pest management. But it also means that it was a very park-like and open space, and it was very easy to gather those acorns in the fall. So if you can imagine that along our corridors, you would have had an understory that was pretty open, was probably very commonly burnt, and you would have had a lot of trees of select varieties, and I'll talk about that in a moment. Now we know, I'm not talking about northern Minnesota, I'm really focused right around here, but there's actually really good data from dendrochronology. That's the information that comes from tree ring data about the amount of burning that happened like in the boundary waters and those major transportation corridors through the lakes and rivers up there, and its influence on blueberry management. Blueberry was a very important crop. And so there's really intensive burning on those acidic soils that produce blueberries. And it is most intensive on those massive transportation corridors. So all of the canoe routes. So again, we see this throughout the whole region. I'm just going to concentrate on things in Southeast Minnesota. All right, and so this is another picture. This was a watercolor. It was done in 1846 to 1848, and it's meant to depict a Dakota permanent residency. So I would point out it is again on a river. And this is for many reasons. It's a major transportation corridor. It's also a great way to get water, right? I mean, rivers are really helpful. Notice all of the wood in that structure, right? So they're very active users and managers. Those are skins there. Interestingly, this does appear to be a domesticated dog. And it's a whole community, right? So maybe nothing really surprising, but when we think about it from the context of natural resources, we maybe look at it differently. And so this is a photograph taken in 1908 of a woman carrying firewood. So Minnesota is cold in winter, and it used to be colder. And so firewood was the way that most people preferred to heat their houses, right? And so people that were in the prairie region, actually, this was a big challenge. And we'll talk about that in some of the homesteading records. For us, it was a blessing having this modeled landscape. We'll talk about that in a minute. But the importance of wood for home construction and home heating cannot be understated. In human history. There's a really fascinating book that talks about sort of the bounds of human civilization and how they are almost always tied directly with trees. And certainly in cold climates, this is critical. And I do feel like there were a couple of slides there that are not seeable. Okay, they're coming. All right. So in this is from the prehistoric archaeology in Minnesota. This photo is taken from Whitewater in Southeast Minnesota. The woodland people, so these are the most recent sort of period of native research that academics do, had access to a rich and varied resource of deep and broad river valleys. They also had small gardens in the fertile bottomlands where they grew squash, beans, and corn. So, however, unlike Europeans, they didn't fence. They didn't have livestock, and they moved around the landscape. And that actually begins to really cause problems later. So we'll go to this one. So this is what they would have been managing prairies for. So a lot of people in Rochester think prairies are the ecosystem that we should strive to. And I will tell you right now, we are the big woods ecoregion. We have enough rain. We should have trees. And that is the dominant ecosystem that it wants to be. And it wanted to be. So to keep it in prairies or oak savannas requires disturbance. We call those early successional ecosystems. And there was significant reasons to do that for indigenous communities who relied on the plains bison, right? They needed that source of fur and food. And an easy way to do that is extend prairies deep into the deciduous hardwood forest. And you do that most easily by burning and allowing the bison to come in and graze. And so those are two really easy ways to get that early successional ecosystem, which is why in prairies, you have to cut the trees and burn them regularly or mow them, or they convert to trees because it wants to be in trees. And so as we think about our future landscape, I think it's important to think how we use it, because maybe we're sad about this, but I don't think any of us need bison to get through our year. And so maintaining those early successional ecosystems is an interesting thing to do. I'm not saying it's bad. It's just I want to be clear about our goals and objectives. So they were very much incentivized. I would also point out another really important meat source where deer are an edge species. So they do really great in this forest edge that you can see there at the back of the picture. And they do great on edges. So you do this land management for bison, and then your deer do super well. And this is good news. Then I talked about this arboreal garden. So they did a lot of intentional management of our forests for nuts and other food production. And so we don't usually think about hickories and acorns as in very important food sources to get us through the winter, but they absolutely were. And so if you look at the archaeological data, the peer-reviewed research, there are keystone species, and white oak is number one, that are indicators of indigenous communities. So you can go into a forest and you can see what's there, and it has these select species, and you can be pretty confident that there was indigenous management on those sites. Now in Minnesota, our tribes used a couple of different things very predominantly. So both Dakota and Ojibwe use maple syrup. So maple basswood forests they do not do particularly well in fires. And they prefer and they do well coming up in shade. So they are considered late successional ecosystem types. So if you're going to manage a sugar bush, you're not burning it every year. It's not really set up for that. So some areas you would intentionally protect because you're going to maintain your sugar bush. And those areas you would go to in the spring when the sap runs. So the sap was possibly running today. So it needs below freezing nights and above freezing days. So the question is, did it freeze last night? And then the sap will run, and then they collect that. It was very important for, again, both the Ojibwe and the Dakota. So let's start with spring. So they're going to be in the maple bush areas. In summer, they're going to move to those areas where they can plant those agricultural crops. So corn, squash, and beans. So think of the river valleys. In fall, they're going to move to these areas where the herds are so they can hunt. And then in winter, they're going to move to these pine islands. So I didn't know if I can credit you. Can I credit you in the office? Or can I credit you for this? Yeah. Okay, so Dr. Scanlon shared some work he had been doing, and he was the one who pointed out this direct translation of Pine Island. So this is the Dakota word, and in his record, there is evidence that they use this as a a break in the winter, and there's clear. This is maybe obvious if you think about it, but being in a conifer stand like pine, spruce, or firs in the winter, you get the protection of those overstory trees. Like physically, it's warmer underneath. They also have their needles on, their leaves are still present, so the snow is captured in the canopy. And so this is very probably where they spent their winters. So Pine Island wasn't necessarily an island of trees in the prairie. I think another way to consider that is it could have been an island of pine in the hardwood because it would have been used for their overwintering camp. And they would have had access to firewood in both the pine or in any adjacent hardwood, oak being a much better type of firewood. So I think understanding, like a lot of people are like, but Pine Island was the only pines around. I'm like, yeah, but that doesn't mean it was the only trees around, right? That just those pines were being used for a really specific thing. Go. You might have to speak up. I don't know what the mic situation is.
The word Zumbro means pine planted river. And I think I'm thinking, and I don't have any proof of this now, but I think that the term planted is probably quite literal. They did, it wasn't just by coincidence that they happened to grow there. I think they actually planted pines there for this winter.
Excellent. So could you guys hear him online? You did? Any indicator? Do you need me to repeat that?
Please repeat.
Yeah, of course. So Dr. Paul Scanlon, who's done some research in this work, says that the translation, the literal translation of the Zumbro is planted pine, and he is wondering if that is literal, like the pine along the Zumbro was planted, and I think that's pretty reasonable. So if you don't, so our pines in Minnesota. Well, I will actually get back to this a little bit, but our white pine in Minnesota is regularly eaten by deer. So I'll talk about deer and their impact on our forests a little bit later. But if you want to keep them and protect them, then sometimes the way to get around that is you plant a lot of them, right? Like the more you have, then the deer can eat some and you still have residual. So we call that kind of overplanting or allowing for greater seed production. And then you get some that make it to maturity. The other thing is that, if you cut a pine tree down, it doesn't grow from the stump. All of our hardwoods, if you cut them down and you walk away and nothing eats it, they'll grow back. But our conifers don't do that. They have to have a seed source. Now, in forestry, we can leave a mother tree or a seed tree. We can leave a tree and it will come back if nothing eats the regeneration. It'll seed out and come back. But if you cut it and you walk away and there's no seed source, which is what happened in the big cutover, which I'll get to later, they didn't leave anything. So they lost all their pine and it came back to hardwoods. And so it is quite probable, I would say, that it would have been intentionally planted. And I think it is very probable that we know they were manipulating the landscape to meet their needs. Like there's no question about that. They were moving walnut around. I mean, they were moving plants around. They were moving seeds around. Totally, absolutely. So that was really great. Thank you. And so again, I think it's just important to recognize that there was stewardship happening for the needs of the people this whole time. We just, like Europeans, didn't recognize it. And so this is what I mean. So I've talked sort of, I feel like ad nauseum about the importance of firewood, but there's also lots of other things that are in our wood. So this is riverbank grape. It grows really regularly all around. This will come up with the Stopel information. We of course have lots of raspberries and blackcaps and all the things. These are valuable and you can absolutely manage for these things. And this is a acorn pancake with local berries on top by my local work team. Now this is when they were really little, but we absolutely went down to the neighbor. We harvested the Bur Oak acorns. We cracked them all open. We did it. And I was not trying to feed my family for a year, but this is the way it probably would have been done, right? I mean, the whole community is involved in this food procurement and you're doing it for specific reasons. It is not just to spend time in the woods. So then in 1787, shortly after the Revolutionary War, the founding fathers are together at the Constitutional Congress and they come up with this land ordinance, and it does many things for us, including organizes our landscape into townships and counties. And I added this because I really love it. I think it was the really, as far as I'm aware, the really first big commitment to public education by the federal government. So one of the lines is, there shall be reserved the lot number 16 of every township for the maintenance of public schools within said township. This matters about who ended up settling and how. And part of this was they needed to pay off war debts of the Revolutionary War. War is expensive and they had to pay them off. The other part is they didn't want all of this land just to go to the wealthy. So they wanted it to be settled. They also had some reasons to do that, you know, for indigenous purposes. Like we were not being kind to Native Americans at this point. So then 1840 to 1850, Minnesota Territory, and I love this quote. This is from Old Times on Portland Prairie down in Houston County. The gold fever immigration to California, which began that year, took from the East and the Middle West the restless and adventuresome class, which left the new territory to be quietly settled by a substantial class of home seekers. I have to say, it never really put that together, but the California 49ers are named for the 49 gold rush. And so everybody was trying to make a quick dollar. They didn't stop in Minnesota. They just kept on going. And so this is before the Homestead Act. So if you wanted to get land at this point, you squatted and you filed a patent, and then you had to claim your patent. So here's the first survey map. You know, these are images you find on that have been taken pictures. So they're not all great quality. There's one that's really much worse coming up. But this is the original survey map of 1854. And the little rectangle up there, that is more or less the Stopel, what will become the Stopel farm. Now they're not there yet. It's really hard to see this. I totally concede. But there are green patches and there are hash marks. You can see the squiggly river. They are delineating in really broad strokes, essentially open land and timber with some brush in these early things. So what we see right here, where we are standing today, is a very modeled and mixed landscape, which is super helpful for a settler who might want to come. Now, this is what that original land survey journal looks like. And so I'll tell you, good thing I can read cursive. But the land before the Stopel, so there's 6 journal entries in this series of land that likely included theirs. And you can see it's bottomland. Brush is mentioned twice. I will tell you, I suspect that is tree regeneration. And I'll tell you why later. One, brush isn't really a thing we talk about. Like you see marsh bottomland is separate. And I suspect this is regeneration. So in the stewardship of that land and the bison were removed, the trees were able to grow. And we'll talk about that in a moment. So brush bottomland, there was a stream, and soil, first rate, mentioned 4 times. So in a couple other pages, I couldn't figure out what the charcoal was about and what the Osage orange was about. So Osage orange is not considered a native plant here. It's considered native further south. I will tell you, in others land survey records here in Olmsted County, they mentioned planted apple and oranges. I was like, what is happening? So I reached out to a local archaeology professor and I said, can you explain this to me? And he said they intentionally planted things at the corner markers. And the fact that they weren't native would have made them easier to find later, and they used charcoal as fertilizer. And I will tell you, as somebody who has actually run lines before, like having to follow survey lines, I cannot imagine having to carry around a bag of charcoal and seeds to plunk in while I'm taking notes. But apparently this is what happened. Now, what is super interesting, so then it goes on to talk about oak. Bur oak and black oak are both called out. Second rate, broken soil, scattered oak timber, aspen. I will tell you right now, aspen is an early successional species that will not grow in shade. So if you're not burning, if you don't have a massive windstorm or tornado, or you haven't logged, you will not get aspen back. So that is a clear evidence of large scale disturbance, or you don't have aspen. So then there were several I couldn't quite make out if they were bur oak or black oak or what. And then again, this reference to first rate soil, but clear evidence, in my opinion, of early successional species ecosystems, which means that they were probably being burnt and grazed is what I think was happening. Now, interestingly, in my next presentation in a month, Osage orange comes back because it's on the list of species that might do well in our future climate. So we asked volunteers to report any Osage orange to us this past year using iNaturalist, and I will tell you, I don't think those survived from the original survey. They could have. It's actually a fairly long-lived species, but they do not appear to be on the landscape. So for what it's worth. All right. And so this is what this landscape could have looked like. So I would point out by 1840, elk and bison are gone from Southeast Minnesota. So if you think back to that, the survey, 1854, 15 years or more, the land wasn't being disrupted and it wasn't being grazed, which is why I think it had come back to the trees, which they may be categorized as brush. So a very small seedling sapling kind of situation. You can see the Homestead Act officially passes in 1862, and it changes many times over the years. Originally, women are not allowed to homestead. And then there's some clarification on that, and women head of household are then able to homestead later. Interestingly, Canada never let women homestead. So for what it's worth. All right, so then Minnesota on the Map is a book, and I love this little quote. So this is from Whitewater, so a little bit east of us, but the farmers on upland prairies secured supplies of fuel and building materials by purchasing woodlots such as the small parcels in section 20. So I've highlighted section 20. But the point here is if you ended up homesteading a prairie-only parcel, it was super hard to make it work. And if there was wood nearby, you were pretty incentivized to figure out how to buy it. And so they ended up breaking up the landscape in some degree just to get access to the timber. The other thing I want to say about the Homestead Act is the Homestead Act required you to do forest management, every single parcel. So if you were in the big woods and there were trees, you had to cut it and grow crops. So you're managing the forest by removing it and growing crops. If you were in the prairies, in order to prove up, you had to plant trees to prove your existence. They eventually changed that a little later when it became clear the trees weren't surviving. But in the beginning and through most of Minnesota's settlement, every single homesteaded parcel had to have forest management on it. It was never framed as forest management. It was always framed as homesteading and agriculture. But this ends up becoming the largest impact to our forests in modern history. So back to the Stopels, they arrived in October. And so if they didn't carry it, they didn't have it. And they did, this is not here, I didn't have a picture, I did try, of the cave that they dug out here on this parcel from sandstone, but this is one in town. And so this is possibly what it would have looked like that first winter when they had 4 adults, several kids, and an ox. There may have been other livestock that wasn't clear in the wonderful records that were sent to me. But what that means is to get through their winter, they were very likely having to get big game. And so you see this mentioned here. Supplies they supplemented their diet by hunting small game and fishing and trout for the nearby South Fork of the Zumba River. And this is really great work that was provided to me by Renee Nation in Farming the Land, the Stopel Homestead. I would be shocked if they also weren't eating any deer they found, any rabbits they found, kind of like anything, which was really common. So we move up the Stopel farm, 1857. They start growing rye, oats, barley, wheat, buckwheat, sorghum, turnips, and oxen. And they have oxen on site. You can see there it is on this map. Maybe you can see about the northern. They didn't own that. You can see Plummer has a parcel, right? I wasn't sophisticated enough to sort of really outline it. But if you look at the sort of the 2/3 of that box is in little circles, that indicates it was in forest. So they had a nice mix of trees and bottomland. And then they are very close to the river. They eventually get access to the river. They own parcels all the way to the river. So this is great. I mean, this is good news, right? And they were able to carve a cave out. So good for them. So here's their land claim, 1885. You can't read it, but they did it. They both successfully, they proved up and they got their claim. Then the Dakota War happens. I think we kind of forget about this. I don't think we forget about it, but the Dakota War is 1862. In Prairie Fires, this book about Laura Ingalls Wilder, there's this really great section where she talks about sort of the initiation. So remember when I said the Dakota people moved around the 4 seasons of the year? Well, New Ulm, Minnesota, was settled by a company out of Chicago, and they targeted the Turners from Germany. That was a very liberal group that believed in moving one's body. So they were gymnasts, the Turners, they turned. And they coupled that with lectures. It was a community that allowed no religion in their public schools from the very beginning. And so in mass, they invested and moved through this Chicago company to New Ulm, and they arrived when the local Dakota people were not present, but their village site was. So the new settlers moved into the village. And when the Dakota appeared at their summer village and tried to move back in, the settlers were like, no. And they didn't yield. And so this is one of the straws that ultimately breaks the camel's back. And, you know, the Dakota feel they've been boxed into a corner, and it results in the Dakota War. Now, I want to just be really clear. I'm going to go back to framing this around settlement, but the Dakota absolutely got the rough end of this. So this picture on the right is Fort Snelling at the internment camp, which inspired Hitler and his concentration camps. This is a horrible bit of Minnesota history. But alas, what it does to us in Southeast Minnesota. So this is the worst picture, I'm sorry. This is downtown Rochester in 1862. I think it was leather bound. And if you zoom in, the bottom picture, the part on the right, is what is now Soldiers Field Park. And to the left of that, the part that isn't parceled is the Memorial Parkway neighborhood. And I know, because I used to own a house there, and I looked at the deed, that about this time there was a lawsuit because of all the refugees that had settled there. And the important thing is, here in 1857, you can see the High Forest Road is running into Rochester. So all those people, so over the next 6 weeks from the Dakota War, fighting raged up and down the Minnesota River Valley as the Dakota tried to reclaim their homeland. More than 200 settler colonists were killed in these raids, and more than 200 women, children, and civilians of mixed ancestors were taken hostage. Refugees fleeing attacks streamed into eastern Minnesota towns, leaving 23 southwestern counties nearly deserted. So any settlement that had started in 23 counties of southwestern Minnesota was pushed back here right at the beginning of winter. So that has pretty major impacts on the local environment, which is already heavily settled and used at this point. So this is a picture of the refugees coming back towards eastern Minnesota. All right, so also happening at this time, 1865, the Civil War ends. They changed the Homestead Act, so there's some veterans benefits and even widow benefits for veterans who were killed. 1863 to 1868, homesteading peaks in Minnesota. Just to run the steamboats, it's taking 5 to 6 cords of wood per mile. Holy buckets, right? Oh, I'm not done. 1865, General Mills opens. 1868, Winona is the 4th largest wheat market in the country. Hence the beautiful Victorian houses in Winona, right? It was very profitable. You can see that picture was 1879. So then our woods. In 1870, sawdust closes the Mississippi River. The major transportation corridor to the upper Midwest is closed because of the amount of sawdust coming out of the mills in Stillwater and up and down the river. All right. So in 1878, Minnesota produces enough wood to circle the globe. Now, most of that is coming out of northern Minnesota. And when we think about Pine County, used to be all pine, maybe not a surprise given its name. I will tell you, foresters today bemoan the fact that people don't like all the oak that grows there. Well, pine was cut entirely. When the loggers came through in this area, it wasn't about regeneration. So they cut everything. And when there's no pine left, there's no seedling. And so what comes up are the hardwoods. They can seed in, they can blow seed around, they do it a little differently. And so that whole county mostly got converted to oak. And nothing wrong with oak, big fan of oak myself, but like a massive land conversion because of the type of forestry or lack of that was practiced. So this is Alberta, Minnesota. And I just want to show you that by 1883, passenger pigeon, wolves, and bears are all gone from southeast Minnesota. And there's the horse and buggy and not a tree to be found. And then we move ahead to the Stopel farm in 1880. So their acreage has increased. If you can see now, they actually touch the river, so very advantageous for livestock and whatnot. And the great data that I got from here said they were planting corn, barley, oats, potatoes, hay, grass seed, chickens, lots of eggs for sale. They had cows, they had a dairy. Joseph had hogs. So hogs are on my radar this year as an invasive species. We're going to have people out looking for them. But hogs were very commonly moved around by Europeans. In Europe today, they finish hogs in the woods all the time. Acorns, chestnuts, all finished on hogs. And so this isn't a surprise. They probably could have been fed with kitchen craps and then finished in the woods. And then they would have been slaughtered and preserved for winter. So it was interesting in the write-up that was provided. They talked about, well, George had wine, but where did he get the grapes? And that picture of the riverbank grape was not an accident. It grows everywhere. It's not necessarily a reliable and great producer, but we have lots of fruit that can be turned into wine. And so it's quite probable that he didn't need to have a vineyard. He could have harvested wild. And I will tell you just a little side bit. So it turns out our riverbank grape is very cold hardy, not a surprise. And they use that cold hardy gene to make our domestic grapes more cold hardy. So all the cold hardy grapes get some of their genetic material from our native grape. All right, and so here else is what, so the Stopels themselves, George and Joseph, they are about 80 in 1980, and so they let their sons take over the farm, and that kind of ends the pioneering days. However, really big important things are happening on farms. So 1892 is the first gas-powered tractor coming out of Iowa. So up until then, you needed oxen or horse to have your farm, to do the plowing and do the work. Oxen or horses, any livestock, cows, they need pasture. That is commonly a combination of actual pasture and woods. So up until about 1900, when tractors really took off, we are keeping livestock on our landscape, which requires a mixed farming approach. And once tractors really take off, livestock gets removed. And now the only time someone really needs to be in the woods is for winter fuel wood. And so this is going to matter in my next things. And I just want to point out, it used to be that grandpa would spend all his winter harvesting firewood in the woods. And so there was this sort of, it wasn't passive, he was very active, but he was managing that woods for firewood production every year, year over year. And when we got central heat, natural gas, and propane, a lot of the activity in the woods ceased. And that has serious implications for today. Taking cattle out of the woods and not using the woods for firewood really changes the equation for forestry today. All right, so this is the first aerial photo I could find. So I will just say 1940, this is after the Great Depression. And that is the era when conservation really comes in. So there's pretty compelling reason that these early settlers were not practicing good conservation management as we would view it today, which likely led to the Great Depression and all of the upheaval. And I would also point out that although Leopold from Wisconsin grew up in Iowa, started 1876 and died in 1948, he wrote the Sand County Almanac, I think it was 42. And so you're seeing this really awakening of conservation across the landscape because of massive degradation that preceded it. Okay, so now I've been talking for a long time. I literally want everyone to stand up. And online, I can't see you, but I want you to do it too. So stand up, wiggle your bodies. I can talk fast, I talk a lot. Okay, so now we're gonna do some breathing exercises because I do a lot of eco-anxiety work. And so I don't know if you have it or not, I don't really care, but we're gonna do this anyway. So breathe in slowly for a count of 4. I will do it once and then you'll do it on your own. 1, 2, 3, 4. Hold for a count of 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. Exhale for a count of 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. Hold for a count of 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. Repeat, do it yourself. All right, I wasn't actually counting. So when you're done, I want you to just take a moment, reflect about how you feel, and then go ahead and sit back down. While you get settled, this picture here is not an accident. So it turns out that the most common images are a picture of nature and water, and that's research out of the Mayo Clinic. So it's not an accident if you go to the Mayo and you see a lot of pictures of water and nature, because they realize it can be stressful, and it's a good way to bring your blood pressure down. So now I'm going to transition to sort of like the usual presentation I give when I talk about forest history. And this is this long view. This is the trend of forest land in the United States. And you can see it goes back to 1630 and all the way to 2006. But you see that tremendous drop off during settlement. And we've never recovered from that. And I'll just tell you right now, that's conversion to agriculture. The largest influence of forest land always is ag policy. So a different way to look at this, we are the blue line in the north, and this is data from 1760 to 2000. It hasn't really changed, but you can see this tremendous drop off during settlement and then a slow creep up. But I think, so here is sort of the height of homesteading, but this I always find to be startling. So clearing forest in the east, clearing of the forest in the east between 1850 and 1900 averaged 13 square miles every day for 50 years. The most prolific period of forest clearing in US history. And I mean, I'm descendant from homesteaders, right? That was not the intent. That was just what happened. We did it. So here's some other super startling facts. Settlers came to North America, cleared an average of 2.1 acres per person to survive and grow food. 5 to 6 million acres of US forests were cleared to produce iron in the 1800s. By 1850, there were approximately 3.2 million miles of wooden fences in the United States, enough to encircle the earth 120 times. Holy buckets. And then again, remember, indigenous people didn't use fences. That was part of why Europeans didn't recognize how actively the land was used, because Europeans use fences. By the late 1800s, railroads accounted for between 20 and 25% of US timber consumption. In 1900 alone, over 15 million acres of forest was cleared just to replace railroad ties. And in this presentation, it wasn't as impactful for us, but I will also just share that the railroads were steam powered. They used coal, and in a pinch, they used wood to keep those trains moving. But then that produced ash, which flew out of the top and hit all of the slash left from the logging and started the big fires like the Hinckley and the Cloquet fires. So massive loss of life in some areas of Minnesota because of forest fires that were a result of the trains and the ash that was coming out of the top hitting the logging flash that was left by the first cutover. And those big fires, of course, had major implications on the settlers and the landscape and the trees. Okay, so at this time, I think it's sort of useful to compare then and today. So I thought this was interesting. Foreign-born Minnesotans were 40% of the population in 1900, compared to only 8.5 in 2021. Working in ag, 40% of the population was working ag in 1900, compared to 2.6% in 21. And owned woodland, now 3.5% do, and only 1.2% own agriculture. So we've become quite disconnected from these resources as a whole. And that is a tremendous change. All right, so this is the first of 2 videos. This is about 2 minutes, and I share it because what ultimately transitioned a lot of crops in Southeast Minnesota was what also caused the plant pathology department at the university to open, and it is now the plant disease clinic, which was in the news last week because their several federal employees got they are no longer employed. So it turns out this is in the news now.
The Department of Plant Pathology was actually formed by necessity. Back in the late 1880s, the power of the Mississippi River was harnessed at St. Anthony Falls, and that power was used to grind grain into flour. So by 1880, about 70% of all the farmland in Minnesota and in the Dakotas was planted in wheat or other cereals. So the mills at St. Anthony were the economic engine that drove the whole region. Those mills produced flour, the flour was exported. So it was a huge value-added economy, and it depended upon the steady flow of grain. And then about 1887, they started having very severe epidemics of wheat stem rust. And they sort of knew what caused it. They knew it was caused by a microorganism, but they didn't know much about it. But it kept crashing the economy. In other words, they'd have these big epidemics, they wouldn't have enough grain, they'd have to close down the mills. So what happened was in 1904, they had some very, very severe epidemics. And finally it got to the point where you couldn't open any new land to the west to grow wheat. So now the problem became, we can't outrun it. What do we do? How do we control it? And then that translated into some political action, which got a senator from Minnesota, Senator Nelson, in Washington to get a revision of the Morrill Act to get some money into Minnesota to form essentially what was a Department of Plant Pathology. Nelson got the money and brought it back to the University of Minnesota and said, okay, now form a Department of Plant Pathology and deal with this wheat stem rust thing. So it was built out of economic necessity because it's an applied science. It responds to crisis.
Okay. So what that means.
The Department of Plant Pathology was actually formed by necessity.
Sometimes it's tricky to get out. Okay, I did it. Okay. I don't lost my remote. Oh, thanks. Okay, so crown rusts were spread on common barberry. And common barberry was very commonly planted in these homesteads as either a living fence for cattle, so it has barbs, or it was planted as decorations like this shrub. And so when they realized that barberry was the overwintering host for this rust that was annihilating our grain crops, they really did this all-out campaign in 1918. These are the yellow are all the times barberry is highlighted in that Painesville paper. And they even sort of tapped into the fear of communism with this ad, destroy it now, a barberry eradication poster in 1918 linking the Bush to national feuds over Russian Revolution of 1917 and the Red Scare that followed in the United States. So you can see the red hand, right? And this is all an effort to get rid of common and Japanese barberry. And you can see both species on each side of that poster. And then they engage the kids. So you can see there's this teacher teaching about barberry up in the corner, and then the kids are going out to scout for it, and they find it, and they alert the people, and they get an award. Whole 4-H clubs were out there actively looking for barberry on the landscape. And we thought we got it. We did think. So this was a whole eradication effort to get rid of this non-native species that ended up being very problematic and was very commonly planted. And so then you can see the kids gathering around the bush. Now, I'm a little sad I couldn't find all of the timeline, but that we now have today, this is our Minnesota noxious weed law. So originally this noxious weed law included things like milkweed that were troublesome in farms before they had really good chemical herbicides. So then when we got really good chemical herbicides, okay, so back before we had really good chemical herbicides and weeds were really common in farm fields and they were a big problem, they passed legislation within the state that required every county have a weed inspector. So the state funded the weed inspector. Olmsted County had a weed inspector, and they went out and they said, hey, look, you've got this problem plant, you need to manage it, let's do that. And then when we got really great agrochemicals and we got really great herbicides, and then you got, you could buy seed that was herbicide resistant, you could play your field, the need for that traditional weed inspector fell off. And Olmsted County, our very own, went to the legislature and said, hey, look, we're going to continue to do this job, but we would like to allocate those resources differently. So you give us the money and we promise to do the thing, because there was less weed pressure. And so the state capitulated, and now the state law requires that you have a weed inspector. But it turns out after that switch, this weed law now is almost exclusively invasive plants that are problems in our natural areas. And Olmsted County hasn't had a weed inspector since I moved here 20 years ago. And now they call it an unfunded mandate, which is kind of true, but they ask for it, right? So I'm like, that feels a little disingenuous. But what that means now is in our natural areas in Olmsted County, there is pretty limited management of it because we don't have this capacity. I'll tell you right now, it makes me really sad. We're one of only 2 counties in the state that doesn't even bother to state a weed inspector. It says to call our county attorney. That makes me sad. And so, and it turns out it's haunting us today. So we're going to stay on the barberry track here for a moment. So many of you may actually have Japanese barberry planted in your yard. It was commonly planted when burning bush was pulled out in older neighborhoods, and it was relatively common in plants. My neighbor just put it in a year ago. I'm sure a local consultant did it. So Japanese barberry was, remember, it was on that poster, right, as having rust. So then they thought they got rid of it all. And then all the Japanese barberry that was introduced was intended to be rust resistant. So they introduced it. And then it turns out there's clearly some common barberry left, because now we're finding hybrids of Japanese barberry and common barberry that is not rust resistant. So now we're getting rust back, right? Thank you for the laugh, right? Like, wow, we didn't learn that lesson. So I will say the Environment and Natural Resources Trust Fund, which hopefully you all voted for, but it passed beautifully last fall, funded a bunch of research to look into this hybridization, to understand the protocols, and to understand the rust impact. And so we have good data about that. The other like oofta is that we know that Japanese barberry is now really invasive in our woodlands. It forms a really dense canopy of thorny understory that is really great habitat for ticks. Ticks are expanding their range as our climate warms. Of course, ticks are known to carry some pretty wicked human tick-borne diseases. So this is bad news. So it turns out these things have impacts. So another species that was planted so someone, if you could hit mute because your phone is ringing, that'd be super great. Is buckthorn. And so that also is an overwintering host for rust that is now the biggest, and soybean aphids. And soybean aphids are the biggest issue, most expensive pest now on soybeans in Minnesota today. And again, there's very limited management of buckthorn, in part because we don't have a weed inspector, because that happened. So we're going to start about halfway through, and this will be about a 3-minute clip.
Let's take a look at who else finds a home on buckthorn. Oat crown rust is a fungi, a pathogen that thrives in oats and barley, reducing crop yields by as much as 40%. When it's not on oats or barley, this pathogen lives on buckthorn, causing small brown leaf spots that aren't problematic to buckthorn. Buckthorn grows abundantly in the upper Midwest. It's everywhere. How did this tree that offers safe harbor for the soybean aphid and oat crown rust become so prominent? It had a little help from other species new to North America. These other new species came with the first European settlers way back in the 1600s on plants and in the soil. In the soil from Europe, there were earthworms. Earthworms are not native to most of Minnesota. They are not good for native forest, as they gobble up the leaves on the forest floor, disrupting an ecosystem that coexists with the native plants, disrupting things like microbes, fungi, insects, plants, and wildlife. The European earthworm and its predator, the Asian flatworm, digest the plant matter and turn it into soil. This worm-digested soil is inviting for new species of plants to move in. Buckthorn seeds like bare mineral soil, compounding the problem. People first brought buckthorn to North America in the mid-1800s and sold it as an ornamental landscaping plant. Buckthorn was planted in yards, in towns, and on farms. People planted it because it made a great hedgerow. If we only knew then what we know now. But there's one more non-native player in this story. In honor of the birds from Shakespeare's writing, a group of Shakespeare fans brought over European starlings from across the Atlantic, had a ceremony, and let them loose in Central Park. That was 1890. These birds took to their new landscape, and along with other species, helped spread buckthorn seeds. Seeds of buckthorn may look inviting to wildlife, but are not nutritious. The birds dropped seeds on the soil that was made friendly for invasives by the advanced team of earthworms living and multiplying below our feet. buckthorn gained a foothold, invading the landscape, and the soybean aphid moved in, causing problems in the field starting around 2000. We use a number of techniques to manage soybean aphid populations, from aphid-resistant soybean seeds to insecticides and predator insects. These treatments focus on where the soybean aphid lives in the summer, soybean fields. But what can we learn if we investigate their winter home, buckthorn? That's what we're researching right now. The people that manage the lands where these ecosystems live, private landowners, state and federal land managers, may have different overarching goals. But one thing they have in common, they all are negatively impacted by buckthorn. Looking at this web of organisms and how they are connected to buckthorns helps us understand how to approach managing pests that span across multiple ecosystems. We may not know the exact relationship between soybean aphid and buckthorn, but we do know that managing buckthorn has a host of other ecosystem benefits. Let's take a look at who else finds a.
So I don't know if you caught that at the end, but that video was actually paid for by the soybean growers. And so this is a pretty major issue. Okay, so yeah, there we go. Okay, so I'm winding down, and then I think I have 30 minutes for questions, right? We're done at 7:30 or 8:30, I think. Yeah. Okay. And so this is kind of going to be a preview of the next presentation more than I really want to get into it deeply. But this is the plant hardiness zone map. And so you can see here in 1990 that the southern half of Minnesota was zone 3 and the northern half was zone 4. I'll just say right now, emerald ash borer has never been found in zone 3. So back in 1990, it would have been reasonable to expect that emerald ash borer couldn't survive in zone 3. Then if you move forward to the most recent map on your far right, 2023, you can see that zone 3 has creeped up until only about the northern third. I will tell you, EAB is right on that edge, right? Lickety split. So it looked like we had the first find in zone 3, and then they came out with the new plant hardiness zone maps. And we're like, oh no, EAB just knew before, right? They were just more up to date than the federal government. Then you can see the central Minnesota is zone 4, and then you can see zone 5 is creeping into Minnesota. This is both an opportunity and a challenge, right? From an invasive species perspective, it means more things can grow here. If you want to bring in more hickories or oaks from the south, it means they may well do well here too. So as we look about our future climate, understanding this change and how it's not what it was, and having a better, clear understanding of who was using it and for what can help us make better decisions about our future. Like, how do we want to use it? So precipitation, this is data, you can see their ranges, so 1891 to 1920. You can see we in southeast Minnesota had greater than 30 inches of rain, and way up in the northwest corner, they had less than 20. Jump ahead to 1981 to 2010, the whole eastern edge of Minnesota has a greater than 30 inches, and there's no place in the state of Minnesota that has less than 20. So what you're seeing is that precipitation increase. If you recall before, I said the thing that makes the difference between a prairie and a forest is rain. So if you look at this, you can see the prairie is being pushed out and the forest is moving in. From my perspective, this is great news, but for you prairie lovers out there, you might have to take a moment. Now, of course, we've had some droughts recently, but our average annual rainfall has continued to increase. Average annual isn't what plants need, so there's still a lot of uncertainty in how we really need to think about this. So for the Climate Ready Woods in a month, I'll really talk about diversity as like a key principle in all of this. And then again, just looking, this is a different way to look at that at a landscape scale, at really a continental scale, but you can see in this data, even from 1971 to 2000 and 1991 to 1990 and 2020, you can see that green has pushed further east, and you're seeing greater annual average, or further west rather, greater annual average precipitation. And what makes this really unique and challenging for Minnesota is we are at the convergence of 4 major continental biomes. That is very unusual. Change is greatest felt at the edges. That's where the most things are moving around. And so we are likely to see the greatest change on those edges. And I'll tell you right now, projections for the North Woods are not generally great, because that ecoregion is likely to push north with ecoregion 3, while the eastern hardwood forest is likely to push further in. So good news for us in southeast Minnesota, we just get more species that we might love. If you're a big fan of aspen, birch, spruce, fir, and pine of the Northwoods, you might need a moment. So with that, this is my ad for the next one. If you want to hear more, April 17th at 7 o'clock, same time, same place. I'll talk about climate ready woods, forests, and prairies. And then my colleague Mary will do a demonstration on tree planting and care. So with that, I think I did it pretty close. So questions, and I don't know if you want to start online, if there are any, I'll.
Yeah, go ahead and get started here and I will ask.
All right, and I will make a point to repeat them. So raise your hands. Excellent.
Simple question. It has to do with buckthorn.
Speak to me.
It seems to me it's going to be take over everything in 100 years. If you look at what's happened just in the last very short period of time, it's incredibly dense, and it will, as I understand it, it will shade out everything. And how do you see the future with the southern half of the state covered with buckthorn and nothing else?
All right. So the question was, what do I do with all the buckthorn? It's everywhere. Can we really manage it? Look at my pictures. So we can make a difference. So it is really up to us. If we decide to manage it, we can manage it. If we decide we don't want to manage it, it will take over. It has absolutely invaded our understory. So in unmanaged areas in southeast Minnesota, it is the dominant understory species, and it will prevent the regeneration of pretty much everything else. I want to say it's not entirely by itself. So these pictures are taken at the Plummer House. And so you can barely see my son through the picture in 2020, and that's because of all the buckthorn, the honeysuckle, and the Japanese tree lilac. I will also share there was plenty of garlic mustard, there was plenty of mother's wort, there was plenty of lots of other things that weren't supposed to be there. The pandemic closed the world. I had 2 kids at home. They had no soccer. I said, we're going to the woods to work. We got permission from Parks and Rec, and boy, did we go to the woods and work. 1 year later, didn't plant a thing, and look at those bluebells come up. Now, me and the boys, we worked at it. We pulled and we cut and we treated and we pulled and we cut and we treated and we did it again. And then the boys went back to school and they went back to soccer, and now it's just me having a blast. And this is 2024 spring, bluebells everywhere. And this is 2024 fall. This is white snake root, which is deer resistant. If you have livestock, it's trouble. But this is an early successional understory. So the buckthorn, all the invasives, cut it back. As long as I keep up with the natives or in the invasives and let the natives get established, I think we have a shot. But it requires continuous stewardship.
Say though, that's you with your passion, and I fear that passion isn't spread very widely throughout our buckthorn forests.
Yeah, so the comment was, it's just me and my passion, not everywhere else. I want to give some credit to Parks and Rec. So Rochester Parks and Rec has been working pretty actively. They take a different approach. They have larger acreages, right? So you're seeing forestry mowing and goats and a combination of things. But over 10 to 15 years, that can do a pretty decent job. They've done a lot of replanting. The way we have split up our landscape, this is by and large a private lands problem. And so if a private landowner does not do that, they will get buckthorn. And it doesn't help the rest of us, because as we know, starlings and other birds move those seeds around. So the more of us can get on board and the more we can actively manage, the better it will be. In the presentation in a month, I will talk about another way to approach that. So let's plant things that won't become problems. Because it turns out 85% of the invasive plants in the upper Midwest, trees, vines, and shrubs, came from horticulture. So what we buy, what we plant, what we tend, and what we steward matters. So let's buy, plant, tend, and steward things that won't become invasive. And I have lots of lists for you in the next session. But great question. So I would argue that, like, if there's a will, there is a way. And we actually have really great tools. We just have to have the will. And that is a question and decision for us.
Yeah, we so much of our landscape, we mow our lawn, we fertilize, we do this and do that. We say, well, that's the woods, we don't do anything there.
I don't know why. Right. Let's go do things, right? I mean, it turns out it is good for our minds, bodies, and souls to get out and work outside. It could be in our gardens. It can just as easily be in our woods. And I tell you, I have both a garden and a wood, but when I go to the woods, no one comes to find me. So I can listen to my audiobook and tend to the woods. And because if they find me, I put them to work, right? It's just a great way to get away. And not that I can't do it in the garden, I do both. Right. But there's like a different itch that's scratched. And I never used to understand how grandpa could work in the woods all winter. And now I totally get it. Right. 100%. And I think we've lost that. I think we've sort of forgotten. And the expectation is you can go in and you can do it once and it will be done. And that is not the thing. And that was never the thing. That wasn't how it was stewarded under indigenous times. That wasn't how it was stewarded when grandpa was working in the woods. That wasn't how it was stewarded. And so we took the livestock out of the woods because of the tractor. So that is a modern invention in trouble. Question from the back.
online, they want to know what other invasive species should we work to eradicate in southeast Minnesota? I know that's a little bit of next time, but.
Yeah, what other invasive species should we work to eradicate in Minnesota, in southeast Minnesota? And I will tell you, there's actually quite a lengthy list. So so in the places I get to have a fair bit of autonomy and control, if it is not native, it is gone. Like, so there's a lot of things that fall into that category. And how do I know? Well, I'm a plant person, so that's helpful, but I don't know all the things. So I use iNaturalist. It's a wonderful app, free on your smartphone. If you don't have it, like, get it. There's a high probability there will be a video clip of that in my next presentation. It is spectacular. iNaturalist. So it can identify anything that's ever lived in the whole world. So anywhere, every time we go on vacation, you can pretty much tell where Angie is because there's INAT happen. And it uses a combination of artificial intelligence to do photo recognition and then a community of people to do a second level confirmation. And if you have internet access, it will suggest an identification using AI on that photo immediately. So I'm out in the woods, I find some spring ephemeral, I can't remember what it is, or I don't know it, and I wonder, wow, is it invasive? I nat it, and it usually lickety split, it comes up. And if it doesn't, I move around and I come back and I have an answer. And so then I can just putz and I can learn and I can enjoy and I can do stuff. So I avoided the question. There are a lengthy list of things that are invasive in southeast Minnesota. I don't, by and large, I don't think it's helpful to have any of them. And many of them you can kind of manage simultaneously. A lot of the woodies require the same treatment. So you can forestry mow, you can goat, you can do herbicide application, it's the same. And then for many of the herbaceous, there's a few exceptions, you can hand pull them. So in that way, you're out there, you can kind of do it while you're out there.
So that's a nice big tease for next month.
I know, right? I was trying. Any others?
Is garlic mustard a problem at this point, besides just being very, but taking over everything?
Yeah, so the question is garlic mustard a problem? Yep, it's an invasive species, full on. Garlic mustard also has allelopathic properties. So in its roots, it produces a chemical that will change the soil chemistry and prohibit other things from growing. So when you see a little bit of garlic mustard get established, you see more and more and more. It can have, many hundreds of seeds per plant. It was introduced as a garden herb. It is completely edible. So I really enjoy garlic mustard on my egg salad sandwiches in the spring. They're just delicious. You can make pesto, you can do all things, but you want to pull it up by the roots and kill it as you do those things, right? So I pull all kinds of garlic mustard in the woods. And I will tell you, 3 years in, there's way less of it. Like if you look in that second picture, there's one plant. And I took the picture and I was like, doggone it, there's a garlic mustard. I don't know if you can see it, it's right here. And so then I very promptly killed it. Right, but it was like a full understory of garlic mustard the first year. And garlic mustard is a biennial plant, so it starts out as a rosette. I pull the rosettes. Like while I'm out there, I might as well, right? And I'm pulling all the little tiny buckthorn seedlings. I'm like, what else am I doing? If I go home, I might have chores. And so I just pull them all. And I don't really kill myself. I know some of those rosettes come back, but it turns out I'm back the next year. So I pull them out when they start bolting and they go to flower. And it is time consuming. So I read, I think, was it in the book about California and Native Americans, but something like one individual can probably reasonably steward 4 acres of land. And I feel like that feels about right to me, and do other things. So we have the benefit of mechanization and some other things that can help us do that. But if you're a woodland owner with 120 acres of infested buckthorn, you're going to need help. And then if you got garlic mustard, but I do want to say this though, about garlic mustard in particular, there has long been a biocontrol that was very effective, but didn't have federal permission to be released. And very recently, like last fall, it was looking very promising that would get released. And that would be really good news for us. Now, I don't know under the new administration if that might change. But it had been tested and retested for close to 20 years. And so there might actually be a biocontrol coming out that can really help us with our garlic mustard.
It's approved in Canada.
Yes, it is approved and released in Canada. And it had finally been approved in the United States, like in November, I think. And so then they were looking at grow facilities. And they had it all sorted out a decade ago. And then it kind of took so long. They had to re-up that. Right, exactly.
Follow-up question, the lower right, what is the common name of that?
So it's white snake root.
Yes, I've pulled out thousands of those.
I wouldn't.
Well, you know, you've got a monolayer of that. That's the reason I've done it, because I cleared about, with the help of sergeants, about half an acre of buckthorn. And this sort of took over and looked like it was gonna look like that.
Yeah.
So it strikes me that if you trade, I mean, I'm not gonna defend buckthorn for a
Mhm.
millisecond, but it does seem to me that you have a dense forest undergrowth of nothing but that. And that's why I've been pulling it, and maybe you have to do it selectively, which is that's what I've done. But what do you do with these things?
Yeah, so the question was in the bottom right corner, fall 2024, it says, what's all that? It's white snake root is what it is. And the question was, well, isn't that kind of just like an invasive species, right? You've traded one for the other. And I will say, I don't think it is. So when I talked earlier about early successional plants, so prairies are early successional ecosystems, aspen is an early successional tree. I think I called this before an early successional understory. So this understory was completely destroyed with those invasive understory plants. And so what we're seeing are these species that do really well in the first flush. And so absolutely white snake root is doing this. I gotta tell you, I love it. Because I figure if white snake root's there, then hopefully buckthorn isn't and garlic mustard isn't. And maybe we can get the creeping bellflower under control. And what I think will happen is what you see with our native early successional species is they rotate through over time. So, if you just let it go, what will happen is something else will sort of become established. So it's change the soil chemistry, it's change the light regime, and then other things will start to move in. So now, frankly, there's mint coming in some areas, right? And so what you see when these transitional ecosystems is like the first things that come in are always the early successional species. And then the next thing comes through and the next thing comes through. So if we look at this, like upscale it to a prairie is an early successional ecosystem. If you stop cutting it back, if you stop burning it, if you stop grazing it, then trees will move in. The first trees will be like early successional trees. So you might get aspen, you might get birch, you might get box elder. If you let those trees go on a tree's time scale, couple hundred years,
Thinking we won't be here, but
right?
it's all right.
So I think this is the impatience of humans, right? But then you get a conversion to things like sugar maple or basswood. Those are shade intolerant, so they'll grow under the shade of the early successional species. And then you'll start to see the next forest happen. So you're just seeing a change across the landscape. And I have been challenging my invasive species professionals. Are we conflating early successional native characteristics to invasiveness? And in my professional world, black locust is on the Minnesota noxious weed list. It is a native tree just southeast of here. It is projected to do very well in our future climate. It has very valuable pollinator characteristics, but it's very aggressive. It's an early successional species. It is the thing that's creeping in on the east side of the prairie at Quarry Hill Nature Center. It has rhizomal spread. It's very aggressive. It's an early successional species doing what an early successional species does in a prairie, right? I'm like, all trees are bad in prairies. Now, I have been totally unable to get it taken off the noxious weed list after 2 rounds of trying, but I've been challenging our people, like my invasive species people, to think, are we just conflating these characteristics of early successional species like white snake root with these other things? Now, you're the landowner. If you want to speed up your succession by yanking out white snake root, just make sure that you're not letting any other invasives come in, and you may well be able to move up your successional timeline. And that is absolutely your choice. As a forester, it's kind of like, if you don't like it and it doesn't meet your goals, then get rid of it, right? Like, nobody loves box elder, but it does super great, right? Like, if that's not your thing, get rid of it. If you want walnut, don't let the box elder grow. So that's how I would treat it. So good question. Are you telling me to shut up, or are you just like, okay? No, it's okay. I'm like, maybe she's telling me something. Any questions from online? Okay.
I have a question. I think you and I talked this last summer.
Yeah.
And around this history center, we've got a lot of buckthorn.
Yep.
And I don't know what else. And we need to plant some trees to replace some trees that are aged out. So can we get together, or can you give me some help with that? And we'll get some students from JM to come out and help.
Yes, that would be great. Yeah, so I think Mary Nesbitt and Nesberg and I were going to put our brains together a little bit, and I for sure can offer you recommendations on species. I was thinking about this actually really specifically, like I am not a landscape architect, so I'm going to be pretty resistant to do that level of detail
Yeah.
for you. But absolutely. And in the next presentation, I am going to challenge you guys to think about what your goals are for the center. Like, how much of it do we want to tie back to settler period? And these are things that I think can easily be done. So you just need to decide what you want to do, right? That are also likely to do well in our future climate. What is your risk tolerance? Like pecan is on our migration potential list. Pecan is a lovely species, commonly used by settlers and everyone else, right? But we don't know its survivability in Minnesota today. So do you want to put one and try it? You want to put 4 and try it? And you not want to have it at all? That kind of thing. But I think those are the questions that we can all think about. And I think they're pretty exciting opportunities. Think of some of these new species as experiments and opportunities. And then there's a whole list of natives that are likely to do well in our future climate. So those are things that are already here and we have a good history with. And so those are like kind of sure bets. So if you just want to, lean into those a little harder, that's a lot less risky. And they still have, and the work that's coming is there are 4 different lists for each ecoregion. We're in ecoregion 9, the Rochester Blufflands and Plateau. And for each region, there are 4 lists. One is native trees that are likely to do well in our future climate. Refugia, so native trees that are unlikely to do well in the future, either because of climate change or other health issues like emerald ash borer and ash trees. Native understory plants that are likely to do well in our future climate, and climate migration trees. For us, they're almost exclusively not considered native to Minnesota, but considered native to the eastern hardwood forest. So what is native and who gets to decide is a whole different question we could chat about. And every single tree and plant on those lists, we have cross-referenced to make sure it is beneficial for some little critter. So think birds, insects, pollinators, or small mammals that live in Minnesota today. So we were able to cross-reference that pecan has value to things in Minnesota today. Sycamore has value to things in Minnesota today, even though those individual species are not considered native here. And that is quite a robust list of trees and plants. Maybe a smidge overwhelming. And that's next time.
If anybody's interested in dealing with buckthorn, I've kept track. I've treated it in Kutzke for the parks people, and so
You want to stand up and tell them who you are? Can you want to stand up and tell them? And if you come here, they can hear you online. Or do you not want to come here?
in 2021, I spent about 6 hours and I used 8 quarts of spray, and there were quite a few good sized trees. Next year, it's about 2 hours of work. I used 2.5 quarts of spray, and there were very few of any size, but there's still a lot of stems. The next year was 2 hours of work and 1.5 quarts of spray, so the less herbicide. I didn't see any seeding, any fruit production. But at fourth year, I still spent 2.5 hours looking through and finding every one, but I only used 1 quart of herbicide. So it's going down, but don't think you do it 1 year.
So it was a great example of the amount of herbicide used year over year for 4 years. And I will say there's new research out of the University of Minnesota. It's like 2 years old now, that buckthorn seeds have only about a 2-year life expectancy. So in the soil, they only last for 2 years. So if you were to cut down all of your overstory trees, and there's no additional seed source, you have about 2 years. If you get rid of all the seeds, you've exhausted the seed bank. So that is a lot less than we used to think, which means that, and this is pretty new data, but like the city of Rochester, for example, could probably forestry mow much more quickly in succession, and they would get all of the regeneration. Those seedlings would be killed, or that they could put in goats or whatever. And then you're just looking at, if you're using herbicide, it really cuts down on the amount of regrowth you have, although inevitably you have some. If you're using goats or a forestry mower, the more quickly you can mow, that you wear down the roots and you can kill the plant that way. I mean, just like if you continue to coppice without letting it grow. And now we know that seed bank is only 2 years old. That's actually super great news. So that woodlot, I mean, I've been pulling seeds every single year for 4 years. It turns out I missed a few, even a few berry producers. So that like happens. But I figure I have 3 more years and I probably won't have any viable seed left. Now it's a little tiny parcel and plenty of the neighbors have buckthorn. So like, let's not really kid ourselves about that, but it's a pretty significant achievement. You got another comment?
Yeah, it's just, you can do your land, but if you've got neighbors, and that's the problem at Kutzke is there's nearby.
Yeah, so let's talk about neighbors. So that like, well, you can do yours, but what about the neighbors? And I say this for climate anxiety, and I'll say it, or eco anxiety, and I'll say it for this. Like, we can create change. Like, we have agency and motivation. We can create norms about stewarding the landscape. It is hard and it takes time for positive, and you won't be successful with everyone, and that's okay. But you can be a good example. You can talk about why it matters. You can do it, and others will. And I will tell you, in the 20 years I've been here, there is decidedly less buckthorn than there used to be. Management has happened. You see a lot more. I mean, I can tell you the woodlots where they've cleaned it out and you're starting to see regeneration. I will tell you, I kind of meant to say this more explicitly before, but we had no deer 1890. They were extirpated from this area of Minnesota. So the woods were cut over. Any trees that came back, think oaks a lot, had no browse pressure. That is super not the case today, right? So I can clean out this woods just fine. The oaks can produce acorns, the white pine can produce seeds, and every single one gets eaten by the deer without exception. So all I'm doing right now is preventing invasive plants and maybe getting understories to establish. I am not regenerating that forest. So what is coming back? I'll tell you, honey locust is coming back. There's honey locust in there. The hackberry is coming back beautifully. Almost every tree you see there is hackberry. How weird is that? That was a goat prairie. If you look at the 1940 area photo, this is a goat prairie. And then it was turned into a rose garden, and it was totally irrigated. There's irrigating pipes all over. I found probably 25 rose tags, plant tags, and never a rose. But I'm sure that's where the honeysuckle came from. I'm sure the buckthorn was planted. The Japanese tree lilac was a gift from our sister city in Japan, planted at the top of the Plummer house, seeded down. That is a miracle. Oh my gosh. That stuff will germinate underneath the full canopy of buckthorn and honeysuckle. So you're going to get Japanese tree lilac to come back. Yeah, exactly. Not really good news. But it's interesting. There are trees coming back. It's just a different type of tree because of the deer pressure. So if you care about oak, you have to manage buckthorn and then figure out your deer problem. Which makes me wonder if we want to manage oak. I love oak. There's nothing against oak. They're wonderful species. But like, if we can't manage our deer, maybe we should change our goal.
Well, a lot of those are going to be gone anyway, right?
Well, so oak wood is fairly spotty, and we have a mixed landscape. Oak wilt does really well in black oak and red oak species on sandy soils, of which we certainly have some, but not all. We also have, bur oak and white oaks and some other oaks. So there's some diversity, but I'll tell you, oak's the bane of a forester because we can't get the thing to regenerate because it's always getting eaten, which is a different problem, right? And until we get a handle on that, which is another communal problem, right? I mean, the state manages the deer herd. I have been wondering if chronic wasting disease will do this for us. But it turns out in Wisconsin, they don't manage for chronic wasting disease anymore, and neither do we, and they have not seen a significant decline in their herd. Now, maybe you all caught, but the city of Rochester has done a deer harvest. I think it's the last 4 years using archers and has had good takes, but that's a drop in the bucket. I'm really pleased, I'm very happy, fully in support of it, but that's not the solution to the forest regeneration problem. So white stake root is totally deer resistant. And it is the thing, I might get it wrong, whether, so it was either Abraham Lincoln's wife or I think it was his wife who was pretty sickly and passed quite early. And they're pretty certain it was milk fever, which is actually the result of cattle eating white snake root and contaminating the milk. That's why you wouldn't want to run cattle through there. But that is why the deer don't eat it. All right, it is totally my time.
We get to have you back in a month, so.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks, online. You're welcome. Thanks for coming.
Yeah. Yes, it is.
And I didn't see anybody nod off.
Thank
So
you.
how are you guys? Thank